Twyla Tharp, the famous American dancer, choreographer, and author, once remarked, "Art is the only way to run away without leaving home." But what is home when it comes to art? Can art be indexed to a certain place, a particular location in which it was produced or imagined? Do the memories of a place, the lived experience of the artist, show through, inform, and shape the art? If so, is there a distinctly Southern art? What is it? Does gender, race, age of a Southern artist, however defined, matter? And if it does, why? Joining us today to help answer these questions and explore the work done by Southern artists, especially black Southern artists, is Abbe Schriber, Assistant Professor of Art History and African American Studies in the University of South Carolina School of Visual Art and Design, and also the Department of African American Studies. Abbe earned her PhD from Columbia University in Art History and Archaeology. She focuses on 20th and 21st century art, performance, and material culture of the African diaspora. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She is currently working on a book about David Hammons and the network of interdisciplinary African American and Afro-Caribbean artists. Abbe, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. This is something that I've been itching to do for a while because I don't know a lot about art generally, and I'm very interested in the connection between place and artistic production, also artistic consumption, right? We'll get to that. Who buys it and why? But before we get into the kind of guts of the conversation, just tell us where you're from and how you came to study what you're studying.
Sure. So I am from Cincinnati, Ohio, which itself kind of inhabits an interesting position, sort of in the Midwest, but really on the Kentucky border on the Ohio River. So Cincinnati was often the first place, right? A port of entry for fugitive slaves attempting to attain their freedom. And that wasn't necessarily in my head when I was growing up. I mean, those histories get passed down and are learned to a certain extent. But I think for me personally, I was trained as a specialist in African American art and art of the African diaspora, meaning, I'm trained within the field to teach and study artists of African descent from the 17th century forward. And even though I focus on contemporary art, meaning the way that I see it, really late 20th century to the now, to the present, many of the artists I'm looking at reach toward the South and toward the material culture, the vernacular art and architecture, the kinds of folk configurations of art and sculpture that they either saw growing up on their visits down to see family in the South, or that kind of loom large in the imaginary more broadly of a kind of Black American culture.
Right, interesting. And I want to circle back on all of those really good points you've just made because they speak to access towards the South. You use the word toward, they're looking toward. And I'm just really curious about what that does in terms of Southernness. But before we get to those specifics, educate me, all right? Tell me about how scholars, either in the past or today, or preferably both, have framed the idea of Southern art specifically. What makes it Southern? How have they gone about this? And how have they changed their positions over time?
Well, Southern art in and of itself does not necessarily have one strict definition. The definitions have changed over time. I mean, I think the most obvious way that scholars have approached it is geographically. So thinking about the original Old South, but even these have discrepancies, right? The slaveholding states versus the states that seceded from the Union, the states that encompass the Deep South versus the Bible Belt versus the Black Belt, right? So there are all these ways of delineating what is typically understood as the United States South, right? And that has historically been understood within a broader landscape of American art as regional, right? So actually Southern art in studies of art produced in the United States has been kind of on the periphery, subordinated really to histories of art making that really have the Northeast as their nucleus.
Gotcha. Which is quite similar in many ways to the literature of U.S. literature with a Southern outlier. Was that true, Abbe, before the Civil War? I mean, was there such a thing as Southern art that was recognized as Southern art and valuable, or was it still always subordinated? In other words, I'm wondering what impact the Civil War had. The victors get to write the story. Do they also get to do the art?
Well, I think what's interesting about that is, nowadays when we think about Southern art of the South, some of the more topical and controversial and provocative elements of memorials and Confederate statues and the icons such as the Confederate flag that are clearly racist emblems of a Confederate past, that dominates our understanding of, a visual landscape for Southern art. But that, first of all, has to be understood as actually occurring largely decades after the Civil War itself, right? So the ways in which the Civil War became memorialized as part of this, lost cause ideology, and, for people that may not know what that is, a kind of valorizing of the Civil War as being fought over states' rights, quote unquote, versus the right to continue enslaving people of African descent. So, the idea that the landscape of public art and memorialization developed right at that moment of the Civil War is actually not true. All of those types of ways of thinking about the Civil War actually occurred many decades later. So the Civil War itself, I mean, in picturing the South and contributing to a Southern art, certainly had a major impact. I'm not sure whether American art as a field embraced it until very recently, in fact. So, I mean, if we even think to Black American contributions to art of the postbellum era, we can think about photography in particular as having a major impact, and that's a huge part of the story of both African American art and Southern art, quote unquote, which are really entwined, in my opinion.
Can we dig a bit deeper into this sort of postbellum African American photography in the South? How can you give us some examples of this, and who was doing it, and how common was it? And where do you find it? I mean, where is it today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I may qualify this actually by saying, some of this photographic material may not in and of itself have taken place in the South, but represented, I mean, there is that, but it also represented figures who had a close connection to the South and who advocated, of course, for emancipation. So Frederick Douglass, for example, being, the most pictured man in the United States in the 19th century. You have even his sons who are part of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So that's Massachusetts, but that regiment fought in South Carolina, actually. You also have a burgeoning middle-class free Black community who are using photography to document themselves and to use photography as a means of combating, the virulently racist and derogatory stereotypical imagery of that era. So that kind of all culminates actually in a study that I use a lot in my teaching that W.E.B. Du Bois did for the 1900 Paris Exposition, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but it was his study of Black American communities in Georgia, and he put together photography albums that were found later in the Library of Congress. But these albums, hundreds of photographs of a range of so-called types of Black Americans, usually, I think, around the Atlanta area. And these were all on display in Paris. And so for Du Bois, right, photography, this is when he's teaching at Atlanta University, photography becomes a means of showing this wide array of Black Southerner at a time when that was a population conceived as very monolithic.
So this is fascinating because it seems to me that this peripheral South to the larger American art narrative suddenly becomes a bit more centered, courtesy of the activities of African Americans who may not be from or in the South, but are trying to capture something about it. And it becomes international, I mean, in the example you just gave. So it's a kind of, not mainstreaming necessarily, but an expanding of what Southern art means and incorporates. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. Did that emphasis on African American photography about the South, did that continue through to the 20th century? And is it still vibrant today?
I think so, yes. There is, I mean, photography is not necessarily my immediate focus, but there's certainly a huge emphasis and interest on photography in the ways that it can represent or misrepresent the South. It, especially during the WPA era, I would say in the 1930s, became a means of documenting in a way that could also and has been argued as harmful and kind of objectifying, right, poor Black Southern communities, but as a means of getting information, right, for the federal government. But Black artists have used photography to kind of flip those perceptions on their heads. I'm thinking too of someone like Richard Wright, who collaborated with used some of those photographs for a photo text that he did in the 1940s. There's also, moving up to the contemporary, someone like Dina Lawson, a contemporary photographer who has a major exhibition at the High Museum in Atlanta right now, and whose images have been, are provocative, but have been, I think, integral to portraying a rich imagery of Black working class Southern folk, as well as a hip hop culture and a kind of cosmopolitan array of figures inhabiting the South.
Yeah, and I think I mean, not that I know a great deal about this, but I mean some of the sort of pioneering work was done by people like Cecil Williams, who essentially documented through photographs the civil rights movement in South Carolina. And it took a certain courage too, because he's taking photographs of things that people don't want to be photographed. And he was very helpful to me when I was working on a book. He allowed me to use one of his originals. I was trying to make a basic point, and it was absolutely invaluable. So it does hard work. Take me beyond photography. Take me into other forms of art, especially in done, performed, and made by African American artists, either outside the South or in the South.
Yeah, so I think another form of art making that comes to mind for people when we think of the South is material culture and decorative arts. And this is in part because while, reaching back to what we were saying earlier, Southern art has been peripheralized in a broader history of U.S. art. That was in part because of just less access to the types of academies and centers and training and materials. But functional arts really flourished here, both by white and formerly enslaved and enslaved artisans and free Black artisans, and in particular thinking about quilting, basketry, woodworking, furniture making. And now we have many, in this particular region, even in the Carolinas, many museums, centers, institutes that are dedicated to craft and to material culture in that way. And of course, South Carolina is particularly rich and celebrated for being this entry point in the Low Country, in the Charleston and Mount Pleasant area, for the survivals of African culture, as well as forms of art making that may have, and to different extents, were retained by people who were taken captive and brought over in the Middle Passage. And so basket making traditions in particular have been, have now reached a kind of major sort of point of visibility. But the material culture in particular in this area is extremely rich. And so, there's many directions that we could think about that. Additionally, we could think about art made by people who are not necessarily trained in academic institutions, right? So this almost, becomes a little bit of a cliche at this point to think about the South as solely limited to, people who are not trained in the fine arts. And I don't want to continue that cliche. I mean, of course, so-called folk art and material culture have a sort of outsized presence here, but they're not the only kinds of art making that define the South.
Is that one of those kind of stereotypes that's been foisted on the South? It is kind of more folk art, more material culture. Is that one reason why it remained kind of peripheral to the fine art conversation?
I think so, because for a very long time, in histories of art of the United States, fine art, histories of art, this is a huge generalization, but widely, right, functional art is not necessarily prioritized, and is not seen as, being engaged with on a higher level, right? That is engaging the higher faculties of contemplation and a kind of cognitive engagement, right? But
well, it's highbrow versus lowbrow, right? It's the quintessential expression when you get. It's what the English said about colonial efforts to do art, right? If they were colonial by definition, that they were aspiring towards this larger cognitive function, but fundamentally, it was not highbrow. And this then replicates itself in the United States, and the South becomes the more functional. Although there are exceptions to that, of course. There are well-known Southern artists.
Right.
But for the most part, if I understand you correctly, is that perception and that reframing of the South as kind of lowbrow, functional, folk.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Thanks for bringing me back to that. So yes, exactly. The South has this reputation, or is sort of construed or perceived as being more backwards or backwater country folk.
So
right?
The art actually reinscribes this larger conceit about the South, right?
I don't think that's true. Okay. I think that it's how the discourses and the kind of scholarship of art history framed it to fit within those parameters. But I think digging deeper and really training new perspectives and frameworks onto the work of folk or visionary artists, artists who are continuing traditions passed down and taught to them through generations of women, of family members, right? You can think about quilting, that it's not correct necessarily to say these are self-taught artists either, because they're working within very deeply learned patterns of mentorship that are simply just not necessarily prioritized, right, within academic institutions. And some of these, you know, there are schools and institutions that are actually dedicated to craft, interestingly, that I'm only just learning about. In Berea College in Kentucky, there's a very widely respected craft school, and a very kind of meticulous passing down of, you know, that Southern Kentucky Appalachian kind of craft. And so there are also these, it's also not totally correct to say that the institution or academic institutions are completely separate from craft, right? So so these things do overlap in ways that are more complicated than they've often been given credit for.
So if I hear you correctly, there's been a kind of happy dissolution of that kind of ownership of what is art, what's proper art, and it's, you know, it's been returned to, and with a recognition, and this is fascinating to me, that the past, family connections, parents, grandparents, they are teaching art in a way that would not be normally done in a formal art school. But there is a recognition that this is a valuable education. This is a different kind of artistic education, right?
Yes, but really only very recently.
Okay, when did that start? When did the canon begin to crumble?
Well, again, it depends on who you're talking to and which canons, right? Because another work that I use frequently in my classes, and I should say that I do teach a class that began as being called Art of the Black Diasporic South, that I can unpack, but that I'm sort of simplifying to just being Black art in the South in the future. But a kind of core artwork that we examine in that class is the film Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash, right? And that film came about, Dash started writing and researching that film in the early 80s, even though it didn't see feature film release until the early 90s. But when she began writing and researching it, it was at a moment when Black women writers and visual artists were actually re-engaging with Gullah cultures in particular as a means of reclaiming, resituating, and reanimating and articulating a claim to Southern Black ancestral heritage, and women in particular being able to find a kind of Black feminist theorization or self-determination within that. So you have Polly Marshall, you have Gloria Naylor, you have Alice Walker, of course. Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens being, you know, a crucial text that we think about in that class. And then all of that sort of culminating really in the late 80s with Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Which then becomes this kind of text for this movement. And so for some people, you know, this kind of interest in the South and the passing down and genealogies of art making in that way have always been at the forefront. But more recently in the art world, so talking about art museums, contemporary gallery shows, catalogs, books, right, that I would say really in the last 5 or 10 years, it's very recent this type of knowledge, this type of work is being shown, collected, You have the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which I don't know if your listeners might be familiar with, but this was a major foundation that collected, and again, very controversial in terms of its patronage of Black Southern artists working outside of academic systems, but ended up forming an amazing collection of work by those artists that then was gifted very recently and dispersed among several major museums. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, now has this cache of amazing works by Black Southern artists, so-called folk artists. So that was able to be put on view.
And when was this? Roughly?
I want to say this was around 2016, 2017, 2018.
So it's in that window of very recent, 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah.
I knew there was a reason we're having this conversation because it struck me that something interesting is happening, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Let me ask you a question. That's a very simple question. I don't know if there is an answer. What's at stake in characterizing something as distinctly Southern art? What does it matter?
It's a great question. It is deceptively simple.
A bit like me, really. But I'm just very curious about this because, and we could say that, we could apply that question to history, on literature. I mean, what's at stake in the art world, for argument? Let's narrow it down a bit. Does it matter?
It does matter. And we don't necessarily, we can talk about it on a higher level because I think whether it's the art world or the literature world, there is also, I think in literature, a renewed attention to how we define and shape and perceive the South. I mean, you have Imani Perry's South to America, which again was very influential for this course that I'm teaching. And, that won a National Book Award. And similar to Perry, to Dr. Perry, for me, it is about the histories, the shared climates, geographies and topographies, and within those most kind of definitively shared histories of plantation slavery. And of course there's micro differences within these things, right? But in general, for me, when I'm thinking about the South, part of what I'm trying to do, and I think like what Professor Perry is trying to do, and several others following a few kind of key theorists who are also prominent in that 80s, 90s moment that I just mentioned. But we're trying to think about the South as not just the U.S. South, but as coextensive with the Caribbean, right? Good. Because the U.S. South and Caribbean have deeply shared histories of settler colonialism that, again, are linked by plantation slavery and indigenous massacre, that are linked now by histories of climate catastrophe, debt. South Carolina itself, the model of plantation slavery here was modeled on Barbados. We can think about New Orleans as its own, kind of very complex climate that is describable within the kind of understanding of a Gulf South, but is indistinguishable from Haitian histories, from thinking about, the patterns of colonization there, and of course the development of Creole and Cajun cultures. So, thinking, I think, more expansively about the South is very much front of mind right now for people that are trying to define it. And the stakes of that are really traceable to these kind of political and social and economic stakes, where someplace like Houston or someplace like New Orleans, which continues to suffer and have, Black working class and low income communities continue to be punished by the climate catastrophes that happen there, that in and of itself, you could make a map of how hurricanes and flooding repeatedly destroy and do not adequately, find repair in these communities. And so there is the broader stakes have everything to do with, I think, thinking about the South expansively in that way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think it's actually very healthy. And we will be talking about this in another podcast on, can we reliably just think of the American South as its kind of, Confederate constitution? And it's not. I mean, plainly it's not. It's prehistory. And if we ignore that Caribbean connection, we end up silencing a good chunk of Southern history. And it's fascinating to me that your particular field here, art, is reminding us of that connection and the perils of not remembering the connection. We lose a lot by forgetting that, don't we? Mm-hmm. Which brings me to your work on the diaspora South, right? I mean, this is really where you're coming from in your work, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of central to what it means to be an African-American or black artist in the South, is intimately connected to places outside of the South. So tell me about I know you're working on this book about David Hammons and a lot of other things. You've been very busy lately. Can you unpack some of this for us and tell us what you're working on and how it figures into this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I think the South is also a place, a space, and a concept, an imaginary that lends itself to diasporic thinking because it is comprised of and it feeds many diasporas, right? So even internally in the United States, the Great Migration from the South to points north and west have fundamentally altered the field as such of African-American art and art of the African diaspora. But we can also think about reverse migrations back to the South. So an artist that I think about a lot who has come up in my work is an artist named Beverly Buchanan, who was actually born in Orangeburg, spent her kind of formative years coming up as an artist in New York City, and then eventually made her way back to Georgia. And she lived in Georgia. She spent her childhood mostly in North Carolina, but her work really came to embrace Southern landscapes, the kind of literal landscape and climate and physical architecture, but also her kind of understanding of a social landscape, I should say, which, alters or changes how people conceptualize the South. Because, if you see, she built these incredible sort of small scale, what she called shacks, or what kind of became known as shacks, that were modeled after cabins and shotgun houses and the kind of vernacular buildings that you would see in a kind of rural Southern space. And she supplemented them with stories that she wrote and that were based on the lives and voices of people who resided in houses like that she had known. And so it gave life and voice and animation to sites that have been seen as indicative of a kind of alleged, blight or impoverishment, or that kind of absent or abstract the lived realities of people from them. But she was someone who was a peer of the artist that I primarily am writing about, David Hammons. Hammons was working amongst a kind of coterie or network of artists who had connections to the South, and Hammons himself was from Springfield, Illinois. But even if one did not have a familial connection to the South, at that particular moment, one of the things I'm trying to explore is why in the 70s and 80s, right, and this kind of what's been referred to as a post-soul moment, definitively post-civil rights, but in this moment where conservatism in this country is starting to close down, protest, dissident, kind of revolutionary or activist voice, and culture and symbolism, and a kind of re-understanding of Africa and of the U.S. South, and the connections between the two are really being drawn upon to kind of mobilize politically in the arts. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to understand, and it entailed someone like Hammond's drawing on vernacular, folk, kind of constructions, ways of building, found object assemblages that can be, that some scholars have traced to yard shows, or, the presentation of materials in a kind of funky and adorned way in one's home and outside of one's home. So all of these things, I think, are part of this desire to understand an ancestral connection on multiple levels, but that is not necessarily just about a kind of straightforward identification with it either.
Sure. I just satisfy my curiosity here. I'm quite interested in the kind of genealogy of information and how it's passed down. Does Du Bois ever crop up in somebody like Hammond's thinking? Or is it just that was then, this is now? I mean, how does that genealogy work, if at all? Du Bois is kind of important to this conversation, as you said at the beginning. Has he been forgotten, or is he remembered, or is it implicit rather than explicit?
I think what's interesting is that these artists are not necessarily making a one-to-one connection on any level in that way. They themselves, so many of the artists that I'm thinking about came out of actually Black arts movement kind of traditions, right? And then you can think about Black arts as having a broader connection to the theorists and the writers who were so instrumental to Black studies, who were shaping the field and were shaping ways of self-determining one's own image. What is interesting to me about this generation of artists is that they broke with the ways that someone like Du Bois, and then the later iterations that would follow, that they were not interested in a kind of straightforward, direct representational art. So no portraiture, no kind of mimetic realism, no figures even, right? They're using materials that would evoke perhaps Black Southern architectures, that would have this sensory relationship for the viewer, that would jog a memory or an association. And in another class I'm teaching, Du Bois, I should say, is, of course, continues to figure very broadly. And more recently, his forays into speculative, even futuristic or science fiction adjacent type of work, that is being picked up a lot more and being thought about. So someone like the brilliant historian theorist Saidiya Hartman has recently drawn upon Du Bois's turn away from sociology, right? So that his own disillusionment with this field and with ethnographic study, right, and its ability to portray Black life, that does have a correlation, I think, to the artists that I'm interested in and am writing about, because how do you portray the Black South or a Southern art or Black art in the South, however we want to kind of frame it? How are artists doing that beyond simply representing or directly depicting or portraying images that can be directly ascribed to a Southern landscape or person.
I have the distinct suspicion that we need to continue this conversation because we could be talking about this all day. And I'm especially interested in Hammond's in particular and his use of the body and the senses, the way to engage the viewer or even the listener, right? But I suspect that would take us down a different rabbit hole. Abbe, is there anything you'd like our listeners to take away from, this conversation? Perhaps, the kind of things that you tell your undergraduate students, like if you have to take one thing away, and nobody ever wants to take more than just one thing, but if you have to take one thing away, what was kind of the message from this conversation and your work?
I think a major takeaway would just be to think critically and expansively about the South and how we perceive and construct it, right? So that there is no the or one South. It can exist in an imaginary form. It can extend beyond geographical borders, and to know and kind of recognize and uplift those who have been marginalized historically within how we define it, right? And who are actually integral to defining the South or Southern art. So in particular, Black artists and writers and makers, but also Indigenous writers and makers and ceramicists and, thinking about the many people to whom South has belonged.
So expansive, multiple, and authentic, right? Has to be true to its history, its multiplicities, and its texture. Professor Abbe Schriber, thank you so much for being on Take on the South.
Thank you for having me.